Alright guys, welcome back. My name is Parky, and we're just going to be going over another set review for Phyrexia All Will Be One. We're going to be going through the green card list, and then we'll be ranking by mana value, so we'll be figuring out what is going to fit along your mana curve as you go through your draft. Keep in mind this is going to be for a limited format, so nothing to do with standard, just for drafting and sealed. If you guys want to join also on Monday nights, I stream on Twitch at 9:30 under the same name, and then we'll jump right into it. Alright, we'll be going from left to right, from worst to best, and I'll have it listed on the slides as we go through. Starting with our green 1-drops, we have Incubation Sac, 1 mana artifact. It enters the battlefield with 3 oil counters on it, and then you have tap 4 in itself, remove an oil counter from it, and create a 3/3 colorless Phyrexian Golem token. Activate only as a sorcery. So the reason why I don't really rate this very well is because it kind of comes down early and it just sits there. I suppose it's going to be late game value, but I'm not a big fan of it because green is going to be wanting to ramp up and have things on the battlefield that's going to add to the battlefield. So that's why I have this a little bit lower. Onto Rustvine Cultivator, 1 mana 1/2 creature. Tap, put an oil counter on Rustvine Cultivator, and then tap, remove an oil counter from it, and untap target land. So this is kind of a bad effect for those tap kind of rampy style 1-drops. It's gonna be a decent body if you're looking for something to block mites, but that's about it. And maybe something for a body down early to help against red aggro, but that's all this card's going to be able to do. Next is Thirsting Roots, 1 mana sorcery, choose 1. Search your library for a basic land card, reveal it, put it in your hand, and then shuffle. And then Proliferate. Obviously I feel like this would be better if this went on the battlefield, but the fact that this has the ability to proliferate too makes this a little better than the other cards. I think it just helps with what you're going to be wanting to do with the archetypes in the set, with all the counters involved. So that has a little bit more upside than the previous cards. Next is Evolving Adaptive, 1 mana 0/0 creature. When it ETBs, it comes in with an oil counter on it, and then it gets +1/+1 for each oil counter on it. And then when another creature ETBs under your control, if that creature has greater power or toughness, then put an oil counter on it. So I think this is a little bit slower than the blue and the red version of this. It's still going to be decent, but I'm not too high on it, to be honest. Especially because green isn't very big on oil counters, so it's not a big deal. Then you have Venerated Rot Priest, 1 mana 1/2 creature with Toxic 1. And so Toxic is when you deal combat damage, you also put a poison counter related to the number after Toxic on the card. And then it has whenever a creature you control becomes a target of a spell, target opponent gets a poison counter. So this is a good rare for the archetype for poison counters, so you're going to really like this. I think this is just a solid 1-drop, but the fact that it's going to be rare, it's going to be unlikely that you're going to be getting this all the time. And if you're going to be picking this first, pack 1, pick 1, it's going to be a little bit aggressive, and you're not going to exactly be locked into that color. So it's lucky if you get that probably second or third pack. Next we have 2-drops, Brant Blight Stalker, 2 mana 3/1 with Toxic 2. It's a creature, so not bad, but the fact that it's going to trade into a lot of 1/1s isn't the greatest. So you just got to hope that they're not going to want to block it, or I suppose they don't have something that can easily kill it. So it's pretty weak. It's probably going to drop off the battlefield, but at best it's going to trade up to a 3-drop, so that'd be the best case scenario. Next is Predation Steward, 2 mana 2/2 creature. When it ETBs, it comes in with 2 oil counters on it, and then tap 3 mana and itself, remove an oil counter, target creature gets +2/+2 until end of turn, and that's as a sorcery. So it's got a little bit of flexibility. Again, I'm not a big fan of oil counters in green, but it at least has an ability, but it's too slow because you're going to be wanting to play 3-drops or use that mana for something else. So that's why I have Copper Longlegs, 2 mana 1/3. That's an awesome name. Creature, reach, pay 2, sacrifice it, and proliferate. So it's the first time we're seeing that, I believe. Oh no, we've seen on the sorcery. So Basically, choose any number of permanents or players and give each another counter of each kind already there. So just so I can go over each mechanic once, so you guys have an idea. Pretty solid because there's going to be a lot of flyers that are going to be trying to chip in damage. There's going to be a lot of creatures trying to put early toxic counters down on you. So I really like this, and then once you can get some counters down on your battlefield or on your opponent, the proliferate is very relevant. So big fan of this, but we have a couple better ones. So on to Canker Bloom. It's a 2-mana 3/2 creature, and then pay 1, sack it, and choose to destroy target artifact or enchantment, or you get to proliferate. So this is basically an upgrade from Longlegs, and yeah, it just has great flexibility as a 2-drop. It's cheap, which is fantastic. The only problem is it's probably going to be hard to get as a uncommon, but it's really nice. Next is Unnatural Restoration, 2-mana sorcery, and it's just a really cheap, really solid reanimation. So actually it's not reanimation because it doesn't go on the battlefield, but it pops back to your hand. So but then you also get to proliferate. Really good. Two effects for 1 and really cheap. So I'm a big fan of that. Armored Scrapgorger, 2-mana 0/3 creature. It gets +3/+0 as long as it has 3 or more oil counters on it, and then it's a tap, add 1 mana of any color. So this is going to be fantastic fixing. And then when it becomes tapped, exile target card from your graveyard and put an oil counter on Armored Scrapgorger. So this is going to be a really easy way to get oil counters on it, and it's a 2-mana creature that turns into a 3/3 eventually, and it also has early play plus it can block. It's just extremely flexible. I would say this is the ideal card for your green 2-drop spot. On to 3-drops, we have Adaptive Spore Singer, 3-mana 2/2 creature with Vigilance, and when it ETBs, you get to choose to either give a creature +2/+2 and Vigilance for the end of turn, and Proliferate is the other option. So not a bad card. I just don't like the fact that it's a 2/2. The Vigilance isn't really that relevant, to be honest, and the only thing that's really solid about this card is the Proliferate, because you automatically get to do that. But that's also assuming that you have something to proliferate. So there is an upside to proliferating. It's just whether you have your board state set for that. So that's why I have this ranked pretty low. Next is Ichorspit Basilisk, 3-mana 1/3 creature with Death Touch and Toxic 1. So I think people aren't going to want to block this. You're going to get your toxic damage through, and then it's also a good blocker on the other side, and it can trade with a couple big creatures. So yeah, really solid, but it's not going to be something you're going to want to pick right off the bat, because honestly, a lot of these 3-drops are pretty solid. Next is Viral Spawning, 3-mana sorcery. Create a 3/3 green Phyrexian Beast creature token with Toxic 1, and then Corrupted. So when your opponent has 3 or more poison counters, it gets another ability of some sort, and this one gets flashback for 3. So you can play it from your graveyard, so you're essentially getting 2 cards for 1 eventually if your deck's set up for it, and I think that's just great value you can get out of it. Next is Contagious Vorok, 3-mana 3/3 creature. When ETBs look at the top 4 cards of your library, you may reveal a land card from among them and put it into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your deck in a random order. And if you didn't put a card into your hand this way, proliferate. So no downside to this. It's great power and toughness for the cost. And you have the upside of proliferating or ramping. And that's why this is a little bit better than your other common, the first one there, your Spore Springer. Better butt to it, and just really solid. So next is Bloated Contaminator, 3-mana 4/4 creature, trample, Toxic 1. And when it deals combat damage to a player, proliferate. And obviously at a rare, this is going to be hard to get, but if you do get this card is fantastic. This is ideal. You're going to be putting through damage like crazy. You're going to be proliferating those poison counters right off the bat. So you're essentially putting 2 on. Proliferating can add up onto any of the counters that are on the battlefield. So I am a big fan of this card, and I think this is the best 3-drop. Next we have our 4-drops, a Lattice Blade Mantis, 4-mana 4/3 creature, and when it ETBs with 2 oil counters on it, and when it attacks, remove an oil counter from it, and if you do, untap it and give +1/+1 until end of turn. So kind of like a pseudo vigilance, little pump to it. It becomes a 5/4, but that's only for 2 turns. But I suppose if you put more oil counters on it, it's a little bit better. I just don't see this being very good, because when it's not your turn, it's going to go back to a 4/3, and then it's not going to block very well. So especially for a 4 mana cost, it's pretty weak in my perspective. So on to Expand the Sphere. 4 mana sorcery. Look at the top 6 cards of your library. Put up to 2 land cards from among them onto the battlefield tapped, and the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. And if you put fewer than 2 lands onto the battlefield this way, proliferate a number of times equal to that. So it's either you're proliferating once and getting a land, proliferating twice, or putting 2 lands on the battlefield. So it has a little bit of flexibility. It depends, because there are a lot of very expensive cards in green, but if your deck doesn't have that, or you're finding that the set has a lot of ramp already, apart from this might just be a waste of a 4-drop when you can have better 4-drops in your deck, and that might just be the case. So I often find in sets, especially in limited, you're finding that these cards are just not worth putting in your deck because you have so few spots to fill. So it could be a very good card though, depending on what, the circumstance. Every set is slightly different, so this might be the one for this type of card. Next is Conduit of the Worlds. 4 mana artifact. You may play lands from your graveyard and tap, choose target non-land permanent card in your graveyard. If you haven't cast a spell this turn, you may cast that card. If you do, you can't cast additional spells this turn. Activate only as a sorcery. So I don't mind this card. It's not bad. It's just, in limited, you're going to be wanting to put something on the battlefield as your 4-drop as an impactful card, and this is just going to be a little bit slower, and you might get trapped in this idea that you can only play 1 card per turn because it restricts you to that. And I think that slows you down too much, and the other player is going to get ahead of you. So I think that this has a deck in standard, but just not in limited. On to Venomous Brutalizer. 4 mana 4/4 creature with Toxic 3. When it ETBs, you may pay an additional 2 if you do proliferate. So this is going to be very solid, especially with the Toxic 3. People are going to want to remove it, because if that damage goes through, you're basically a third way to killing your opponent with the poison counters. So very good. And then with the proliferate too, you're just bumping that up even more, which is very, very aggressive, and I'm a big fan of this card. Next is Plague Nurse. 4 mana 3/4 creature with Toxic 2, and then you tap 3. Each other creature you control with Toxic gains Toxic 1 until end of turn. Activate only once each turn. So this could honestly be flopped with the Brutalizer, but if you're in a strictly toxic deck and you're able to activate this is going to really dig out some damage really quickly, and they can maybe block some of your bigger creatures, and your smaller creatures will still do quite a bit of toxic damage. And I think that alone makes your weaker creatures more concerning to block, and it's going to put a lot of pressure on somebody. So that's why I think this might be a sneaky common to pick up in green. Next is Evolved Spinoderm. 4 mana 5/5 creature. It ETBs with 4 oil counters on it, and it has trample as long as it has 2 or fewer oil counters. Otherwise it has hexproof. And then at the beginning of your upkeep, remove an oil counter from it, and then if there are no oil counters left, sacrifice it. Super aggressive. I love the fact that it has trample, and I think that this is going to be a very solid 4-drop. I just keep seeing solid green rares, and I think that's really going to make green stand out above some of the other colors. Next are our 5+ drops. We have Sylvok Battle Chair, 6 mana artifact equipment, and our first for Mirrodin. So whenever it enters the battlefield, you create a 2/2 rebel creature token and then attach it to it, and that creature gets +4/+4 and trample, and then equip 7. So this card starts off pretty decent. You get a 6/6 trample for 6, which is exactly what you want. That's a good stat line. But then you're probably not going to equip it again just because it's cost 7. You'd use your whole turn up unless you're flooding out I guess this makes your smaller creatures better. It makes, I suppose, all of your other creatures better, and the trample is very relevant, but I just find that this is going to be a very hard casting card. Next is Paladin of Predation, 7 mana 6/7 creature, toxic 6, and then it can't be blocked by creatures with power 2 or less. So they're going to have to chump with their bigger creatures or maybe trade off. It's going to be a good card. I think the cost is pretty high still, but as a sweeper at the end, this is going to be a very, very stressful card for the opponents. Like the toxic 6, that damage goes through, and who knows, maybe you throw, I don't know, you throw trample on that any way you can get, and this card is very deadly. So that would be the only scenario where I see this card being, you know, a very impactful card, other than just being kind of a filler big creature for green. Next is the Twilight for green. We've got 1 green and X sorcery. Reveal the top X plus 1 cards of your library. Choose a creature card and or a land card from among them. Put those cards into your hand and the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. If X is 5 or more, instead put the chosen cards onto the battlefield or into your hand and the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. So a lot said there, but essentially you're paying quite a bit to just try to get a creature into your hand, and even more so to potentially put it on the battlefield. Like if you really want it on the battlefield, I suppose you can. It just seems like very expensive. You're paying 6 mana to get a creature on the battlefield plus a land. If it was 2 creatures, maybe, but it's strictly to 1 creature, so that limits this card quite a bit, and I think it's the worst Twilight. Next is Sky Scythe Engulfer, 6 mana 6/5 creature with reach, trample, and it can't be blocked by creatures with flying. Really, really solid. Any of the flying decks are gonna hate this card, and it's gonna also, you know, push through some damage. Maybe you get toxic on it. That's probably the best case scenario for that card. It's pretty much the opposite of the Paladin of Predation, but it's easier to cast. So I like this card, and it's solid on combat, on offense and defense. Next is Nauseous Assault, 5 mana sorcery. Creatures you control get +2/+2 until end of turn. Whenever a creature blocks this turn, its controller gets a poison counter. So that's going to be deadly in any scenario, whether you're going to be tempting them to either, you know, add up on poison counters or lose life. So it's a kind of a 1-2 punch, and they have to make the decision. The thing is, they do get to make that decision, which kind of limits you to, you know, what you can control. But, you know, these sort of anthem effects are always pretty solid, and I think it's pretty good. Thrun, Breaker of Silence, 5 mana 5/5 legendary creature, can't be countered with trample, and can't be the target of non-green spells your opponents control or abilities from non-green sources your opponents control. As long as it's your turn, it has indestructible. So, very good. Troll that looks like a turtle. I don't know what's going on in that card, but I like the art at least. And it's going to be hard to remove, and it's going to put through a lot of damage. So it's a pretty big body, and it's not that hard to cost for 5. It's pretty good value. So really good card. It's not anything crazy strong, but I like the fact that it isn't indestructible on your turn, but it'd be nicer if it was indestructible counters like the other creatures. Oil Gorger Troll, 5 mana 3/4. When it ETBs, you gain 3 life. Then if you control a permanent with an oil counter on it, draw a card. So this is going to be another solid value card. Not a great stat line for the cost, but you gain life, you draw a card. Those are the 2 things that you're going to want out of your cards, and there's not a lot of life gain in the set, so I guess take it where you can. And it's a common, so it's pretty decent for that sake, because you're going to be seeing them every so often, and who knows, maybe there is a oil counter deck out there in green. Next is Tyrannax Atrocity, 5 mana 4/4 creature with haste and toxic 3, and the fact that people have to react right away to this, whether they have a blocker or not. This could be, you know, there's a board wipe and you draw this and you play this down right away and you could finish the game. So I like how sneaky this card is, and green doesn't often get too much haste, so I think this is going to fit right in at the top end of your mana curve. Next is another Tyrannax, but it's the Rex, a 7 mana with 3 of those being forest, 8/8 creature, can't be countered, and then trample, ward 4, haste, and toxic 4. Lot to swallow there, but basically if you're going green and your main color is green, this card is going to be the best card in your deck hands down, but it's going to be a little bit harder to cast. But I suppose if you have 7 mana on the battlefield, you're probably going to be able to have 3 of those being forest, you'd hope. And this card is insane. The haste, trample, toxic 4 all together plus the ward 4, so if they don't counter it right out, oh, they can't counter it, and then it's going to be incredibly hard to remove, so it's insane. The only thing is the downside, especially in limited, is the difficulty to cast, so you have to include that, so that's why I have these next 2 ahead of it. Speaking of which, Nissa, Ascended, Animist. 7 mana, 2 are forest, 2 are Phyrexian mana. Legendary Planeswalker, so our Planeswalker in green. We have 7 loyalty on it, but when it's completed, if you pay any Phyrexian mana, it loses 2 loyalty counters to start off. So it can come in as a 5 loyalty or 3 loyalty. The +1 is create an XX green Phyrexian horror creature token, where X is the loyalty of Nissa, which is solid no matter what you cast it at. And -1 destroy target artifact or enchantment, which is very relevant in the set. And then -7 is until end of turn, creatures you control gain +1/+1 for each forest you control and trample. And that's insane. And the fact that you can play this for 7 and do that right away is really, really nuts. So probably one of the better Planeswalkers in the set. So obviously you find this card, you're keeping it. Whether you can maybe try to splash, or say this is your off color and you can maybe get some, what's that artifact that taps 1 and gives you 1 mana of any color. But if you have that, this card's going to slide in because the Phyrexian mana help you out. Next is Zopendrel Hunger Dominus, 7 mana legendary creature, 4/6 with reach. At the beginning of each combat, double the power and toughness of each creature you control until end of turn. So we've seen that in enchantments before, I believe in Crimson Vow. And 2 Phyrexian mana, sacrifice 2 other creatures, put an indestructible counter on Zopendrel. That's also crazy because you don't even need to tap mana for that. You can just pay the life and it has indestructible. And it's a counter, like how I mentioned the previous card that had indestructible. It would be better if it had this, because that's permanent, right? So they have to remove it, and every time you proliferate, it adds another indestructible counter onto it. So incredibly hard to remove, and I think this card is fantastic. On to our interaction and removal, we have Carnivorous Canopy, 3 mana sorcery, destroyed target artifact, enchantment, or creature with flying. If it was a permanent, if the permanent's mana value was 3 or less, proliferate. So this is a better version of the canopies that you've seen in the past, but it's still not very solid and limited. So obviously this is going to be maybe if you're playing traditional, I could see this working, but other than that, not so much. Next is Titanic Growth, 2 mana instant, target creature gets +4/+4 until end of turn. Very simple pump effect, very standard in green because there's usually 1 of these in every set. So it's going to have its worth, especially if lots of trample, then I could see that being pretty relevant. But other than that, it's just going to be a filler interaction spell if you can't find removal. Next is Ruthless Predation, 2 mana sorcery, target creature you get control gets +1/+2 until end of turn, and it fights a creature you don't control. So obviously it would be better if it was a deal damage to target creature based on its power. But the fact that it gets 2 toughness added to it does help the fact that this is a fight spell, but the fact that it's also a sorcery spell makes this a little bit worse. So this is some last minute removal if you need to, if you're desperate. Next is Maze's Mantle, 3 mana enchantment aura with flash. Enchant creature when it ETBs. If enchant creature has toxic, it gets hexproof until end of turn, and then it gets +2/+2. So this is a little bit situational based on, obviously, if you're a toxic deck, it's going to be great. But it's still not anything special, but it does help with avoiding any removal, especially exile spells that you know, the indestructible counters won't help with necessarily, so protecting some of your big creatures this way might be good. And it's good on any trample creatures too, so there's that also. After that is Tyvar's Stand. 1 mana and X, instant. Target creature you control gets +X/+X and gains hexproof and indestructible until end of turn. This can protect your creature for 1 mana. This can bump your creature up and push through some damage. I think it's really flexible in the fact that it's super cheap and it's at instant speed. This card's going to be great, and there's no doubt why it's an uncommon. Next is Infectious Bite, 2 mana instant. Target creature you control deals damage equal to its power to target creature you don't control, and each opponent gets a poison counter. So the fact that this is 2 mana at instant speed, it does exactly what you want to do for removal in green, and it adds a poison counter. This is everything you want in this color, so you want to pick up as many of these as you can because they'll go fast. And that's going to be it for green, guys. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Please like and subscribe, and if you guys have any comments on maybe something that you would choose different as the best card at each mana value, please let me know. Also, join me on Twitch at 9:30 on Monday nights, and I'll be doing some gameplay. I might be going through some of these, maybe a recap of these set reviews, and we can talk about it. Definitely open to suggestions. And feel free to check out my other reviews of all the other colors. I'll be coming out with the multicolor artifacts and blue later on this weekend. And that's going to be the video, so take care and ciao.